All right, really quick. This has come up a few times in a couple different capacities, even the last week, for some of the applications and people I've worked with, and it's more of a review of control panels, start to finish, simplification. But what I would like everyone to think of this time around as we're walking through this is at every point of this, there's a place to have a discussion with your customer. There's an engagement factor you should be taking, and it's not a matter of just passing paper and providing price. You should understand what they're trying to do and um, to help with your credibility with your customer, being able to have that conversation with them. Oh, I see that you're doing this. Would it be better to, look at some of these other options? Maybe there's some design changes or some things that they haven't considered or even knows available. So that becomes very important when it goes to a control panel and all the different steps along the way. Control panels are very simple. You just think of the powertrain. There's a control circuit. You can see it both right there in the drawing, right? Here's your control circuit. There's the power to the heater. Try to illustrate that out, visualize it to the customer. There is a YouTube on this that breaks it down. You're welcome to share that with them as well. Anything to make that whole sales process simpler. But more importantly, when you're first getting an inquiry, when you're first discussing things with a customer, this is your chance to interject or discuss, again, back to that engagement. What are we trying to do? What does the customer really need here? And so, you can go from discussing the disconnect to maybe even a breaker option. We could be talking the transformer. Line fusing, I'll explain what that is, but that does have a factor when it comes to how you break up your load. Do you need smaller individual loads, however the elements break out? There's a lot of discussion to have there. Your over temperature sensor, back to your options available, you can show them, do you need communications? Do you need to walk through stuff? And then they have their own signals. And that's the big question to ask right away. What are you looking for, power control and feedback from that? So I did want to point that out and just kind of give a quick walkthrough of a control panel anatomy. We've done this before, and I'm not trying to bore anyone. Just a couple key things to point out as we continue to sell and discuss with our customers, especially when we're limited to the FaceTime we have. So when we have them on the phone, when we're discussing things with them, it's important to kind of break it down for them and explain this to them. Disconnect's pretty straightforward. You either have a disconnect or you have a breaker, and in a lot of ways they do the same thing. They just do it in different ways. And a true disconnect is what we call an offload, where you actually physically disconnect the power from the load. And that's the most common thing in an industrial control panel. You heard through door is very common. It's in our literature. That's what that is. Transformer is, you always need a transformer for the control circuit. Control circuits aren't 480, 600, or in some cases medium voltage, as we're up to 4160 and 6900. All that transformer internal is doing is taking some of the power feed and creating a control circuit itself. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Think of, I don't know, high school physics, right? Inductive loads, that's all that is. We don't make those, we just add them. But then we get into the control circuit, and that's really easy. What are the options? The things we talked about at the very beginning of the presentation. What are we looking to do here? What kind of communications do you need? And that'll dictate which controller that we put in there, ultimately the cost and the options that they're looking for. I like this breakdown because I didn't have this years ago, at least what some of these things mean. You can talk about entry level, mid level, advanced level. That's how the Chromalox breaks that down. And then you have customer signals, indication lights. Maybe they want feedback of some type. Now, those are handled, first of all, you need the contacts or the terminal block inside our panel to put those, but a lot of those are dictated by the controller you pick and the signals you need. So in doing that, and there's also how to program and map those if you want to watch that video as well. That is there. That's something you can say, hey, if you don't understand that, here, watch this and see what we're talking about, because there's some feedback and controls. That is a touching point with the customer. Hey, what kind of feedback do you need from your control panel? That's pretty easy, right? But that's also that level of engagement. And then another one that surprisingly is a very popular discussion is the panel conditioning side of things. If it's in a hot environment, how are we cooling it? If it's in a cold environment, how are we keeping it warm? Now, we got a lot of obviously options here available between heating the panel to cooling the panel to even purging the panel. Purging the panel is very, very important. And I point this out and I describe this a lot because you would be surprised, all of you on the call, how many times a quote gets held up because we're either trying to clarify the area condition or how to match the enclosure and the design to meet the spec. Now, we don't make enclosures as Chroma-Loks, but we do buy enclosures and then modify them to meet the needs and the approvals of the area. And that could lead to a lot of different options. And this is a discussion that you should have with your customer. This is a great touching point to, help that credibility with your customer. And as example, I used one I had years ago where it wasn't so much moving the panel out of the area itself. It was simply getting it a meter away from any connection. So we were able to keep it on the same skid. And then there was a whole list of other things. This is going to be a -40. So we designed a clear cover with it, that actually heated itself, but we still need to have indication. So it got quite elaborate, but because we were able to have that discussion and walk through that with them so well, we got a lot of dollars for this. That is a sales strategy. That is something that if you can talk about up front, you're engaging the I&E guys and gals, the electrical group and the process group all at the same time and saying, have you considered how you're putting this together and how you're controlling it? And it's just a really good discussion to have with your customer and to be able to have. From there, there's line fusing. That's, just protecting your equipment. Your equipment is, and then that I do want to point out, and this is from a previous presentation, sizing, speaking specifically to NEC, National Electric Code. Your conductors and fusing is 125% of the actual load when you go to size it. And your breakers and your other equipment, your switching devices, so that would be your breaker, your disconnect, your SCR, or your contactor, is 80% of the actual load. The load is the calculated part of in our world, it's your heater, right? It's what we're providing. It's that, industrial resistor, whatever it is, duct heater, immersion heater. We have to size the electrical equipment in the panel at 80% of that load capacity. I'm sorry, that you need it. Basically, you're putting 20% on it. It has to be oversized to protect the equipment. So you would go that much higher. And that's illustrated a lot in our products selection guides and all that. And so then there's your load, there's your presentation. You are all more than welcome to use it. I just hope I just wanted to touch on that so everyone could see it. And then I'll move on to the next section. If there's no questions or comments thus far, I left a couple points in there to take a break for everyone. All right, a couple things to point out about panel selection that I've seen recently and I'd like to go over. So we've got our catalog, we've got our panel selections. Number one, does the application need a contactor and SCR? You've seen our basic controllers, you get more advanced controllers. It's important right away to select what you need. If you need to know the difference of how the power switching is done, obviously contactors 100% on off, depending on how many contactors you put in a row. That would be your turn down. SCR, there's a couple different ways to do it. Time-based, dot-fired, and we have trainings on all of those. You're welcome to review out of that. Purpose of this portion of the presentation is panel selection. Now we have a nice panel selection guide in the catalog. It is older, but it is just as valid today as it was before. What kind of control you want? SCR, contactor. That's simple. Step 2, area classification. I talked about having that conversation with the customer to identify not only the heater location, but the panel location first to make sure we're selecting the right enclosure, the right type of enclosure environment as well. From there, it's pretty simple. I skipped to step 4 because this is, the technical specifications, means signals, inputs, outputs. And then if you walk through it, it's actually, even though it's an older form, an older specification data sheet, it's still the same thing. It's pretty simple. It's easy. Your questions you should be asking in the sales side of this when you just got an RFQ. This should be the first thing you start to review. Hey, do I know what I'm doing here? Do I need an SDR, contactor? What's the enclosure requirements? Are they, IP66, whatever that regulation is? And then then to customer specifications. These are the input output signals. What are they specifically needing feedback on? And then the areas are all laid out. So quite frankly, you don't have to learn much. You just have to follow the sheet. And then our catalog is laid out pretty much exactly the same way. There's a couple gotchas in the mix. I use this as an example in one of my previous presentations. Let's say we do have a 15 amp load. We're selecting a basic controller, which is our contactor for 4464. You may notice that the designations are a little off, and that's from the years, different product managers, they bounce around a little bit. In this case specifically, we're going to pick a -3. Well, the 3 was selected, I think, because of the NEC code. It's still a 40 amp breaker, but it's a 3 because 30 amp would have been the max on that. You got your area classification, customer specifications, if any, and then your load fusing. Pretty simple, pretty basic. I don't want to bore you with that. Even the SDRs walk through the exact same way. You should know that already. If you don't, that's pretty easy. Although I do want to point out, if you get to the larger selections, when they start to break into circuits and stuff, so we're obviously selecting larger amp loads broken down into smaller circuits. But when we get to this would be the load fusing and how you lay it out. I do want to point out that again, that 80% of load or 125% overload for the wiring and the fusing, it is calculated in there. It's in the notes. If you never read the fine print, it is in our catalog. It is written right there. That's why you'd have a designation of, say, a 9010 is actually a 10 amp fuse, but it's only good up to 8 amps. I mean, it's noted there. I just want to make sure everybody's aware of it. And then for everyone on the call, not to further bore you, I'll wrap it up here really quick. A couple things I do want to point out: when you are selecting your panels out of the catalog, you're obviously matching them up to the number of circuits and the size of the heater or the load, but there's not a wrong answer here to everything. You just want to make sure they match up. So in the example I'd done previously on a previous presentation, I'd used a 54 element load, but that can be broken into multiples of 3 or 3-phase. Fair enough. So you have different amps per circuit. So guess what? That's different selections. That's different fusing. So it's just different layouts. Just something to be conscious of. That's all. I just wanted to point that out. It's actually very easy, and you should be able to do it yourself. A couple things that do come up with your customer and questions you do get, I wanted you to be able to go back and reference. For years, the industry standard was a radial pattern. You can obviously see where there's some issues of even flow and distribution of heat through a vessel or a tank. That's still very much out there. The wiring gets a little odd. Sometimes even the busing are different sizes, which gets confusing. We now have the triangular one world design. If you need a picture, an example, or you want to show a customer, it is there. It's very simple. We can actually fit more elements into a design, and you get better heat transfer. So that's maybe a sales point, a quality point, or maybe even just something to point out to your customer. A lot of you, whether you know or been asked or know this off the top of your head, what is our default? Do we do a 3-phase Y or a 3-phase delta? It is delta. It is because, quite frankly, if you lose an element, it has less impact to the output of the unit. And that is our Chromalox standard when you configure or design a heating element. Can you still get a Y? Yes, but that is the default. It's important to bring out to everyone. We can get creative, so I encourage everyone on the call to get your RTSM involved if you see something that's maybe not on the page, not normal. This was a case where we did power distribution in the terminal itself. So this was a multi-circuit unit that we were able to just put terminal blocks in the terminal housing. Easy example. Just wanted to point that out as we get creative. Now, I do want to point this out to everyone because strangely, this has come up quite a bit lately. When you get requests for T ratings and temperature ratings, basically for the terminal enclosure, uh, arguably whether we have them, we don't, what do we do? I don't know what to say to the customer. I don't even know where to reference. In the catalog, page B90, it's in there. And that's the distance of standoff from the process. So you have a process temperature, and then you have a temperature that you're approved to be. And this is going to dictate what kind of power wire, the sheathing on the power wire, the temperature it's rated to. So it's in the catalog. It's easy to reference. When you get a request for T ratings on your heater, go reference that sheet. It's all right in front of you. So then you have price guides available. You have that. This stuff you should know already. Don't need to really point that out. I do mark out an example. I'm actually going somewhere with this. You can design your heater. You can price it from the price guides that are published. You can add them up for the different selections. Everything that we just discussed, you can find it on the website. That's all fine and good. But we have the old configurator. Now we're having the new configurator come out right now. Currently, the DIN controllers and the ITLS panels were just completed last week, 2 weeks ago, actually. Those are posted and available. If you don't have a login, you can contact me or Keith Cameroon. After the presentation, we'll get you a login. Right now, like I said, there's only the ITLS and the DIN controllers. If you've been using the previous configurator, that's still available for your standard designs. I was told this should be all the other panel designs will be available pretty much midsummer around July, but you can kind of see how much it is definitely a step up from our last configurator. You do get a conceptual design. You can download, you can see the little blue sign there, download and send those to your customers on what you pick. Pricing's available. I certainly wanted to point that out to everyone on the call, as that's going to be really nice, and especially going in the future for submittals and pricing. Another topic I wanted to cover really quick, only because it doesn't fit into our next presentation. This will only take a second. We have had many presentations on pick and ship. A couple specific things I want to just point out to everyone. Pick and ship panels don't necessarily have to be just for pick and ship products. You've got the amp rating, you've got the style, you've got, only 3 separate designs, pretty basic, right? You got a contactor, an SCR, and a through-door design. There's a training on that to explain everything. You're welcome to walk through that. I'm not going to bore everyone on the call, but they're IP66 NEMA 4 panels. I want to note they say power control assembly. As a sales strategy, when you're talking to a customer, and I'm as guilty of this as anyone, we'll say, hey, let's talk about your control panel. Well, control panel can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. You think a control panel on your desktop, your, MCC, maybe it's an HMI display. Control panel, you just want to be cautious with that term. But I really like that we're now labeling these as power controls, power control assembly. How are you switching power to the heater? And that goes back to everything we just discussed. You could be selling them just SSRs. You can, a max pack. We can use a controller. We can couple them all together. And as what we normally would call a control panel, it's a power control assembly. And that's how we started labeling these as in our literature. That's how we're selling them in pick and ship. They are available. They are quick. Even if you're configuring and selling an immersion heater that's not a pick and ship, you can still use a pick and ship controller. You can, plug them in. The ones back to, the sub panel mounted stuff, that's where these things are being utilized. They're saving space, money. They're building them up. If you do need through door design or visual indication, then yes, you're going to have, your controller through there. There is an option for that. And, they're off the shelf. I like that they give a breakdown of, where your costs are going to fall into play. They are significantly less, and this program has been opened up to distributors as well. So when you're out selling, this can get you out of a bind a lot of times if you find a heater. Even warehouse selling, right? We have heaters on the shelf. There's pick and ship stuff. There's other stuff available. Just know you have that in your back pocket in case you get into a situation where you need something quick. and cost effective. So